Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Will the First Minister remind us what was the promise she made 7 years ago about the attainment gap in Scotland's schools?
First Minister.
It was to close the attainment gap over this Parliament. I think at the time I made that commitment, it was referenced as being within a decade. I still remain committed to doing that and happy during the course of this question and, of course, to talk about the progress that we're making.
Douglas Ross.
Well, it was to close the attainment gap, not to keep it where it was, not to narrow it a little, not to make some modest progress. No, Nicola Sturgeon wanted, and I quote, to close the attainment gap completely. But figures published this week confirm that the attainment gap at primary school is even wider than it was 3 years ago. It's wider for reading, for writing, for literacy and for numeracy. The attainment gap isn't closing. Since Nicola Sturgeon made this pledge, there has been no progress. Hasn't the First Minister failed to keep her promise to young people across Scotland?
First Minister.
No, and just to be precise, because I always like to be precise, the specific commitment that was made was to substantially eliminate the attainment gap, and just for the avoidance of doubt, that was the wording. That was the wording in our manifesto, and I stand by that completely. And pre-pandemic, the poverty-related attainment gap was closing. The negative impact of the pandemic cannot be ignored in Scotland or elsewhere. In fact, the Department for Education south of the border said this about the attainment gap. Disruption to learning during the pandemic has had a greater impact on disadvantaged pupils, so that's something that is not unique to Scotland. But what we actually see in the statistics published this week is that recovery is now underway, and we're starting to see improvements again. So the percentage of pupils achieving the expected levels in 21-22, which is what the latest statistics cover, is higher than the previous year for all primary school ages. In fact, we saw the largest single-year increase in primary school literacy and numeracy since the data collection began. And there is also signs that the attainment gap is again narrowing, with the biggest single-year decrease in the gap in primary and literacy levels again since records began. So that is the progress we are making. Was that interrupted by COVID? Of course it was, in countries across the world. But we continue to see that progress, and of course we remain committed to driving further progress. We also see that progress in exam results. They show the gap between attainment levels in the least and most deprived areas narrowing from the 2019 level, which was, of course, the pre-pandemic year. And we've also had university application end-of-cycle data in the last few days as well. A record number of 18-year-old Scots securing a university place this year, and the number of 18-year-olds from the most deprived areas has also increased by 31% since 2019, again to a record high, and again demonstrating the progress we're making on closing the attainment gap and widening access.
Douglas Ross.
It's telling, when I have a short question, the First Minister tells the truth, because she did tell us that she promised to close the attainment gap. When she's got time to ruffle through her big folder, she doesn't actually accept that, and she says the promise has been met. It hasn't. She has failed people across Scotland. And yet again, Presiding Officer, what we get from the First Minister is the COVID shield coming out to protect her. But let's look at pre-pandemic, because even in the few areas where there was some very limited progress before the pandemic, the improvement was less than 1% per year. It would have taken over 4 decades to close the gap at primary school level if we had carried on at that level. And at secondary school, the Curriculum for Excellence attainment gap wasn't even closing at all. And the First Minister still tries to say this year's results are a positive. But the fact is, the gap has only just returned to the 2016 levels, where the First Minister made the pledge. Basically, she wants us to believe we're winning the race, when in fact we've only just got back to the starting line. This year's figures show that at least 1 in 5 pupils are still not meeting the expected level for each of the essential core subjects. That's what the First Minister defines as progress. 1 in 5 children not reaching the standard we expect. And what makes this even more ridiculous is what the First Minister said in 2015. These are her words. If you're not, as First Minister, prepared to put your neck on the line over the education of our children, then what are you prepared to do? First Minister, do you still stand by those words?
First Minister.
100%. There are fewer things, if anything, more important than the opportunities we give our children and young people. Of course, when we talk about the attainment gap, we, to be accurate, should talk about the poverty-related attainment gap, because it is poverty that drives that. And of course, one of the measures of our commitment to tackling that is putting money into the pockets of the poorest families in the country, at the same time as Douglas Ross's party takes money out of the pockets of the poorest families in our country. Now, just to go back to the specifics, firstly, I do accept and did accept the premise of his first question. I then went on simply to give the precise language that we use so that there is no dubiety. Secondly, and Douglas Ross, if he likes accuracy, should perhaps start to practice it. I didn't say the target had been met. That's a target for 2026. What I said, and backed up with lots of evidence, is that progress is being made. Thirdly, I wasn't using COVID as a shield. I was citing the evidence.
Thank you.
I was citing the evidence of the impact of COVID, the same way the Department of Education south of the border do. Disruption to learning during the pandemic has had a greater impact on disadvantaged pupils. Or if he doesn't want to take the word of a government run by his own party, how about the CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation? The findings add to a heavy body of evidence telling us that socio-economic inequality in education, already entrenched before the pandemic, has grown. Again, though, we are seeing progress in narrowing the attainment gap. We see it in the figures published this week. We see it in exam results. We see it in access to university. It's not yet job done, which is why I stand by everything I said, that it's one of the most important things this government is doing, and that's why we'll continue to take the action to achieve it.
Douglas Ross.
Progress, First Minister. Just look at the percentage of S3 pupils achieving third level or better in literacy. The attainment gap in 2016-17, 13.6%. In 2021-2022, 16.3%. That is not progress, First Minister. A First Minister who told everyone, to judge her on her record on education. It was to be her #1 priority, the big test in her time in office. But she's failed on the attainment gap, failed on class sizes, failed on standards, failed on violence in schools, failed on teacher numbers. Nicola Sturgeon wanted us to judge her on education. She said her neck was on the line. If that is the case, if the First Minister wants to be judged on education, if her job is on the line, if, as she said, there are fewer things more important than education, then why doesn't Nicola Sturgeon ditch the de facto referendum and make the next election all about her record on Scotland's schools?
First Minister.
Well, I tell you, Presiding Officer, the judge of how long I stay in this job isn't actually Douglas Ross. The judge of that is the people of Scotland. And on all evidence, the people of Scotland think that when it comes to a choice between me and any of the other leaders in this chamber, then they want me to be First Minister. I take that responsibility very seriously, and I will continue to do the job to the very best of my ability. We will continue to take the action. He talks about teacher numbers. There are more teachers per head of population in terms of our pupil population in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK, including where the Conservatives are in power. Spending on education in Scotland is higher than it is where the Conservatives are in power. And of course, as I have already demonstrated, while there is considerable work to do, we are making progress in narrowing the attainment gap. We're seeing that in the figures this week, we're seeing it in exam results, and we are seeing it in the fact that a record number of 18-year-olds from deprived areas are now going to university, something that I am proud of and everybody across Scotland should be proud of as well.